Let's talk about language attitudes and what makes them so fascinating. First, the psychological nature of attitudes means that our feelings about language are actually quite complex. They involve not just what we know about language, but also how we feel about it and how we behave in response. Next, there's the evaluation problem. This is a really interesting point. Our reactions to language are rarely based on the language's intrinsic qualities like beauty or logic. Instead, what really influences us are social evaluations of the speakers themselves, who they are, where they come from, and what they represent. Moving on, sociolinguistic competence is about recognizing the social signals embedded in language. For example, being able to identify a prestige variety, or a more socially valued way of speaking, is a key part of understanding social dynamics, even if we don't choose to speak that way ourselves. And finally, artifacts of community. Because our impressions of language are tied to our sense of identity and community, regional varieties of language act as artifacts, visual, cultural markers, that help create a collective sense of place. All of these points tie back to the overall idea that language isn't just about words. It's deeply linked to social identity, perception, and community. Let's talk about the components of attitudes towards language. First, we have the cognitive component. This is all about what we know or believe about a language, its history, its usefulness, or how it relates to other languages we know. It's the knowledge part of our attitude. Next, we have the affective component, which is about how we feel when we think about the language. This could be pride, enjoyment, or even personal feelings like finding the sound of an accent beautiful or, conversely, harsh. It's the emotional side of our attitude. Then there's the conative component, which reflects what we are likely to do because of our attitude. For example, might we enroll in language classes or choose to use certain phrases in our daily conversations? It's the behavioral aspect, how our feelings and beliefs influence our actions. It's also important to recognize that sometimes these components can conflict. For instance, a person might believe that a standard variety of a language is better for job prospects, but feel a strong loyalty and emotional attachment to their local dialect. This kind of internal conflict is quite common and highlights how complex attitudes towards language can be. Understanding these components helps us see why people might feel torn or act inconsistently when it comes to language choices. It's all part of the bigger picture of how attitudes shape language use and identity. Let's talk about overt versus covert prestige. Overt prestige refers to varieties of language that are widely recognized as standard or correct. These are often associated with the wealthy or powerful, and they tend to be the models used in schools and media. When you hear someone speaking in a very polished or formal way, that's often linked to overt prestige. On the flip side, we have covert prestige. This is linked to non-standard vernaculars that might not be accepted publicly, but they carry a lot of social weight within specific groups. These forms signal group solidarity, toughness, or local identity. Despite being stigmatized outside those groups, speakers value these forms because they reinforce their sense of belonging and identity. Now, often there's an interesting dynamic called overt stigmatization. Here, non-standard features are criticized as sloppy or lazy, but that criticism usually reflects social biases rather than actual grammatical logic. It's more about social status than language correctness. Finally, dialects serve as powerful identity markers. They can reveal where someone is from, their social class, or their ethnic background. So language isn't just communication, it's a way we signal who we are and where we belong. All of these concepts tie into the broader theme of how language reflects social identity and power structures. Let's take a closer look at the communication accommodation theory, or CAT, which was pioneered by Howard Giles. Essentially, this theory explores how people modify their speech styles depending on who they're talking to. It's about adapting your communication to respond to your conversation partner's needs or social cues. What's really interesting is that this adjustment isn't static, it's dynamic. People tend to shift their language based on social psychological motives like seeking social approval or trying to maintain their own sense of distinctiveness. So, our language choices are often driven by the context and our goals in the interaction. This accommodation happens across all levels of language, whether it's the accent we use, our grammar, vocabulary, speech rate, or even how often we pause. It's a comprehensive process that influences many aspects of how we speak. And at the core, Kat emphasizes the micro-level interactions, those real-time exchanges, where individuals draw on their understanding of broader social and cultural norms to negotiate their relationships. It's about how, in each moment, we're consciously or unconsciously adapting our speech to connect better with others and manage social dynamics. So, in the context of our overall theme, Kat highlights the importance of understanding how language functions in social interaction and how we actively shape those interactions through our communication choices. Let's talk about speech convergence. This is when a speaker subtly adjusts their way of speaking to become more similar to their conversation partner. You might not even notice it, but it often happens naturally. The reason people do this is usually to be polite, to gain approval, or to show that they're on the same wavelength, creating a sense of solidarity or connection. In multilingual zones, this process can take on an interesting form called receptive multilingualism. That's when each person uses their preferred language, trusting that the environment and social context support this kind of language switching without issues. Successful convergence depends on a collaborative attitude. Both people need to be willing to accept small deviations from their usual way of speaking. It's all about prioritizing effective communication over strict adherence to norms. When both parties are open and flexible, it really helps create a more comfortable and understanding interaction, which ties back to our overall theme of how communication adapts to social contexts. Let's talk about upward and downward convergence. Upward convergence happens when a speaker starts to adopt the features or speech patterns of someone with more power or higher status. It's like trying to show respect or align yourself with someone you see as more influential. On the flip side, downward convergence is when someone moves closer to the speech style of someone with less power or lower status. For example, adults might use baby talk with children, or a manager might simplify their jargon so that workers can understand better. What's really interesting is how adaptable speakers are. They can shift their style depending on who they're talking to. This flexibility helps them connect more effectively with different people in their audience. And this process, known as accommodation, isn't just about social politeness. It's a strategic tool. Sellers, for instance, might adapt their speech to encourage a customer to buy, while interviewers might do the same to gain cooperation. So overall, these convergent strategies are powerful tools in communication. They help us build rapport, influence, and understanding across different social contexts. Let's talk about speech divergence. This is when someone intentionally shifts their speech style to create a sense of distance from their conversation partner. It's a way of signaling that they are different or want to stand apart. A key concept here is asserting distinctiveness. For example, working-class men might increase their use of swearing or vernacular language when they're talking to university-educated outsiders. They do this deliberately to set themselves apart or to communicate their identity more strongly. Another example is choosing a language that the other person doesn't use. Think about Arab nations issuing a communiqué in Arabic rather than English. This isn't just about language preference. It's a clear political statement, an act of non-accommodation that signals independence or resistance. Overall, divergence helps us understand how language can be used actively to navigate social distance and identity, fitting into our broader theme of how communication shapes social relationships. Now, let's explore the motivations and tactics behind divergence in language use. One key reason is resistance to authority. When minority groups, for example, use their native language like Maori in court, they're often doing more than just communicating. They're displaying their cultural identity and pushing back against the dominant power. Even if they are fluent in the standard language, choosing to speak their native tongue can be a powerful statement. Another motivation is status assertion. People who aspire to move up socially might deliberately diverge from their current social group, speaking differently to signal their desire for a higher social position. It's a way of saying, I see myself somewhere else, and I want others to see that too. The social meaning behind language switches is also quite interesting. Switching between languages, say Buang and Tokpisin, can serve as cues for different social meanings. Sometimes, switching signals solidarity, showing connection and community. Other times, it might convey power or authority, depending on the context. Finally, divergence can be a form of identity performance. People often create antilanguages or antiworlds, linguistic spaces that exclude outsiders and build internal solidarity. It's a way of constructing a shared identity, reinforcing group boundaries, and expressing who they are through the language they choose. All these tactics highlight how language is not just about communication, but also about identity, resistance, and social positioning, core themes that run throughout our presentation. So, one of the risks and social costs involved in language and accent is that sounding too much like an outgroup member can actually raise suspicion. For example, there was a case where a fluent bilingual Canadian was treated like a spy simply because he sounded too French. It shows how sensitive listeners can be to perceived deviations from expected speech patterns. Now, if someone shifts their accent or speech style, and it seems like they're going too far, people might interpret that as them trying to hide or misrepresent their true identity. It's not just about the words they use, but how they sound overall. Reactions to these accent shifts really depend on the reasons people attribute to them. If someone's divergence from their usual speech is unintentional, maybe because they're still learning or not fully proficient, it's generally tolerated more. But if the divergence seems deliberate, it can be seen as antagonistic or even deceptive. And this ties into a broader social dynamic. Mastery of a standard variety of language by a minority group can sometimes be viewed negatively. Instead of seeing it as skill, peers might see it as an ethnic betrayal or accuse the person of acting white. This underscores how complex and charged language identities can be within social contexts. Overall, these risks highlight just how intertwined language, identity, and social perception are, and how they can affect individuals in subtle yet impactful ways. When we talk about style as a social response, what we're really saying is that style isn't just about personal preference or individual flair. It's deeply social, meaning it's shaped by and oriented toward the people we're communicating with. It's less about mechanisms like attention and more about connecting with others. Speakers tend to craft their style primarily for their audience, whether that's the person they're directly addressing, a larger group of listeners, overhearers, or even those eavesdropping without direct interaction. Language becomes a resource here, a tool we use not just to convey information, but to create and continuously recreate our identity and interaction. Most of the variation you see in someone's style actually comes from changing the way they speak because their audience has changed. If you're speaking to a formal group, your style might shift to be more polished. If you're talking to friends, it might be more relaxed. So, in essence, style is fluid and responsive. It's shaped by social context and the audience's expectations. This idea ties back to our overall theme, emphasizing that language isn't just about words. It's about social positioning and relationship building through communication. Let's take a closer look at style shift and referee design. Referee design happens when a speaker deliberately shifts towards the speech patterns of a reference group that isn't physically present, in order to claim a particular identity or align themselves with certain social meanings. For example, in New Zealand TV commercials, you'll often hear non-New Zealand accents, like British RP or Cockney, to evoke associations with aristocracy or streetwise toughness. This use of language isn't just random. It's a creative strategy where speakers draw on language resources from outside their immediate community, like distant dialects, to craft unique voices and identities. It's a way of positioning oneself or a product within a certain social or cultural space. Now, related to this is the concept of initiative shifts. These are essentially moments where the speaker redefines their own identity in relation to their audience. It's like a conscious move to reshape how they are perceived, often to connect more effectively or to align with a particular identity they want to project. All of these strategies, style shifts, referee design, initiative shifts, are part of how language is used dynamically in social interactions. They help speakers navigate their identity and influence how their message is received, which ties back to our overall theme of language as a powerful tool for social positioning. Let's explore acts of identity. What I find fascinating is that every individual creates a verbal system, a way of speaking, that reflects the groups they want to be associated with at a particular moment. This means that our identity isn't fixed or static. Rather, it's constantly being built and reshaped through our discourse and social interactions. Think of it like this: we locate ourselves in a multidimensional social space. These dimensions are defined by the various social groups we recognize and identify with. So, depending on the context, we might align more closely with one group or another, and our language reflects that alignment. Ultimately, identity can be understood as the linguistic construction of our membership in one or more social categories. It's through the words we choose and how we present ourselves that we actively shape and express who we are in social terms. This idea ties into the broader theme of how language and social behavior intertwine to create our sense of self. Now, let's talk about the constraints on performing identity. These are the key factors that influence whether someone can successfully shift toward a new linguistic norm. First, there's the ability to identify. This means the individual needs to be able to recognize which specific groups they want to resemble. It's about knowing who those models are. Next, there's the opportunity to observe and evaluate. You have to actually have the chance to watch these groups in action, to analyze their behaviors and understand what makes their linguistic norms work. Without that observational window, it's hard to imitate effectively. Then we have motivation. This is crucial. The person's motivation has to be strong enough to push them to choose to adapt and change their behavior. If they're not sufficiently motivated, the effort to shift might not happen. And finally, flexibility to adapt. Even if someone identifies with a group, observes their behaviors, and is motivated, they still need to be physically and socially capable of making those changes. Sometimes, external constraints or social pressures can limit this flexibility. All these constraints are interconnected, and understanding them helps us see why shifting linguistic identity isn't just about desire. It's also about having the right opportunities and abilities. This is central to the broader theme of how language and identity are shaped by both internal and external factors. Let's talk about language crossing. This is when someone performs in a way that's different from their usual style of speaking. Often, this involves exaggerating features that are associated with other groups or situations. We call this stylization. Now, speakers might adopt varieties of speech that belong to other groups. Why? To challenge racial boundaries or to express cultural hybridity. This practice is known as language crossing or styling. It's also interesting to note that this process involves combining different stylistic elements, like dress, speech, and mannerisms, to create a new persona or sense of self. We call this bricolage identity. In places like London, multi-ethnic peer groups often engage in crossing, mixing bits of languages like Punjabi or Jamaican Creole. This acts to denaturalize or loosen racial boundaries, creating a space where cultural and racial identities become more fluid and flexible. Overall, language crossing reveals how people navigate identity and challenge social boundaries through expressive style. Let's explore how identity construction works in multilingual contexts. As we see, communication patterns are often quite fluid, with speakers shifting between different codes depending on the situation. This code switching or code mixing is a way for individuals to adapt to changing social and cultural environments. Language choice becomes a powerful resource, allowing speakers to manage and express different facets of their identities during interactions. Additionally, using multiple languages intentionally in written texts can serve as a form of resistance, challenging dominant monolingual ideologies that often marginalize minority languages. It's a way to assert linguistic diversity and challenge hegemonic norms. Finally, whether a language continues to be spoken widely depends on its social status, the demographics of its speakers, and the support it receives from institutions like schools and government. These factors play a crucial role in language maintenance and revitalization efforts. All these points highlight how language is deeply intertwined with identity and power in multilingual settings, tying back to our overall theme of language as a social resource. Let's explore how gender attitudes and identity are shaped through language. Gender, as we understand it, is not just about biology. It's a social category that we learn and perform over time. It's a gradual process of figuring out how to do masculinity or femininity in a way that aligns with our culture's expectations. An important point here is that the language we use can either open doors to power or close them. For example, speaking a particular linguistic variety, what we might call the right variety, can give you better access to societal resources. Conversely, using the wrong variety might limit those opportunities. People often use specific linguistic features to present themselves as a certain kind of woman or man, whether they want to appear proper, tough, sophisticated, or any other identity. These choices help us communicate our gendered identities to others. Additionally, discursive strategies, like one-up moves, where someone tries to assert dominance, or complaint sessions, which can reveal personal dispositions, are ways language connects to how we see ourselves and others in terms of gender. They serve as tools for expressing and reinforcing our gender identities within social interactions. Overall, this shows how language isn't just about communication. It's deeply tied to how we construct and navigate gender in society. Let's talk about the fluidity of linguistic identity. What this means is that people don't have just one fixed identity. Instead, they often have multiple shifting identities that change depending on the context. Sometimes, these identities even conflict with each other, which makes the picture even more complex. Speakers convey their identities through signals, both verbal and nonverbal, like using hedges, intonation, or particular speech patterns. These signals help them take stances in a conversation and craft their identities in real time. It's almost like a performance, where the language and style you choose reveal who you are at that moment. For example, think about high school categories like burnout versus jock. These labels show how individuals perform their identities through specific vocabulary and vowel variants. It's a way of signaling belonging or identity within a social group, and it's very contextual. Lastly, narratives about ethnic identity reveal that these markers aren't static. They change over generations, reflecting what we might call contradictory or ambivalent self-reflections. Our sense of identity isn't fixed, it evolves, and that evolution is often visible through language. All of this ties back to the overall theme that linguistic identity is dynamic, adaptable, and deeply tied to social and personal contexts. So, to wrap up, the key idea here is that linguistic variability actually drives both novelty and successful communication, especially in our increasingly globalized world. Instead of thinking of language as static or fixed, we should see it as a dynamic tool that adapts and evolves. Our linguistic choices are deeply influenced by the social identities we want to project, whether we're trying to fit in, stand out, or express who we are. This means that we don't just flop through the world with a fixed way of speaking. Instead, we carefully craft our language to reflect our social context and aspirations. Importantly, there's no single correct way to speak for an individual. Instead, speakers use subtle variations in language to position themselves within society. These variations help us communicate not just information, but also social meaning and identity. And at its core, language is a continuous process, something that is constantly being replicated, modified, and reshaped every time we speak. Each conversation adds to this ongoing evolution, making language a living, breathing entity. So, in essence, understanding linguistic variability helps us appreciate how language functions as a powerful tool for connection, identity, and innovation in our interconnected world.